Once we know a business is safe to invest in, we need to make sure it's a durable business. Today we're diving deep into the competitive moat. Let's find some value. The idea of a competitive moat was first coined by Warren Buffett, and it refers to a company's advantage and presence within its industry. That term moat puts into perspective for us what the game of business is like. Business is warlike. It's a competitive game, and the competition is fierce. Businesses are always vying for more market share and dominance within their industry, and most of the time, that dominance comes at the expense of other players' success. That's not a bug or a bad thing. That's just business working the way it's supposed to. Remember, healthy competition is good. Healthy competition forces players to provide the best value they possibly can, because if they don't, someone else will, and they'll become irrelevant. Competition punishes complacency, and by doing so, it rewards us, the customer, because it provides us with the best products and services that we demand. You can think about it another way. The default state in business is economic decay. Capitalism, by its nature, drives down prices. Once a company has made it and produced high profits, it attracts attention from others who want to make the same amount of money. They enter the space and produce the same products and deliver the same services as the incumbent. By doing so, they drive down prices and profits start to disappear. So a complacent business, a business that does nothing about this, is going to decay naturally over time. But a good business can escape that fate, and it can do so by developing a competitive moat. In other words, something structural around the company that prevents it from decaying. Let's dive deeper into what the competitive moat actually is and what it entails. A competitive moat is a persistent structural advantage that allows a business to earn returns above its cost of capital over long periods of time and despite facing competitive pressure. Here are a few important things about this definition. First, a competitive moat is persistent. It's something that has proven itself over a long period of time. If an advantage only lasts 2 years, then it's not a moat. If it lasts only one cycle, then it's not a moat either. Moats reveal themselves over long periods of time, in other words, over decades. Second, a moat is structural. In other words, it's something that has become inherent in the business. It's something that's baked into the way the business operates. A moat is not great management. It's not product cleverness, it's not a great marketing campaign, and it doesn't have to do with timing and momentum. Those things can help, and they're important, but they're a matter of agency, not structure. Those things are inputs that can help create moats, but in and of themselves, they're not moats. A moat is something that competitors cannot easily replicate, even if they have the money, are smart, are motivated, and are aggressive. And so the question we need to ask ourselves to understand whether a company has a moat or not is the following. If a well-capitalized competitor begins to copy this business really well, what's going to stop them from stealing the market? If the answer is that the company's got a great management team or they execute really well, then those are not examples of moats. Another way to think about it is like this. If an advantage disappears once competitors try hard enough, then that advantage wasn't a moat to begin with at all. Third, the competitive moat is something that allows companies to earn returns above the cost of capital over long periods of time. That's very important, because a company can grow revenue, it can grow earnings, it can even look dominant. But if it does so by spending a lot and injecting new cash into the business through debt and equity, then it's not really creating value. It's just getting bigger. Moats exist to allow companies to generate excess economic returns, returns that outweigh the cost of capital that they put into the business. By cost of capital, we simply mean the expense the business pays to infuse more money into the business, which is either interest if the money comes from debt, or dividends and share price growth if the money comes from equity. If a business can't produce returns higher than its cost of capital, then it's actually destroying value. It's spending more on its resources than its resources are able to generate. Alright, now why are moats important in the context of long-term investing? Well, we invest in stocks for the long term because we want them to compound in value over time. But suppose a company earns returns that are equal to its cost of capital. In that case, the business hasn't created any new value. Its size might have increased, but it hasn't generated excess returns. What if a business earns returns that are lower than its cost of capital? In that case, the business has actually eaten into its own value and destroyed it. But if a company can consistently earn returns above its cost of capital, then it can take those returns, reinvest them, and produce more. Now, stocks will only compound in intrinsic value if the company is able to do this over long periods of time. That's why we like moats. We don't need them because they sound good or because they make us feel good, but because they're essential to compounding value over time. If a company can generate high returns and reinvest them and defend them from competition, then we don't need to rely on value multiples expanding, we don't need additional leverage, and we don't need to time the market perfectly and expect for good business conditions in order for the company to take off. The moat will do the job. But without a moat, the opposite happens. High returns attract competition, competition compresses margins, returns fall back to the cost of capital, and growth and profitability become a lot harder. So in the game of business, as we said before, if a company is not well positioned, it's going to decay over time. The moat is what prevents that for us. It's what allows time to work in our favor and create that compounding effect and stave off natural decay. Alright, so let's talk about how moats come into existence. Some moats can be developed quickly if a company creates something really unique and innovative in its industry. But for the most part, moats are built gradually and through reinforcement. Also, moats typically don't rely on having a single advantage, but having multiple advantages stacked on top of each other. Let's go through the major advantages, starting with network effects. A network effect exists when the value of a product increases as more people use it. Now, how is that possible? Well, the way network effects work depends on the business, but it can happen in a number of ways. When adding on new users creates more connection opportunities, more data, more counterparties, or more complementary products, then network effects start to appear. Each additional user improves the product and increases the switching costs of moving to another provider. That in turn makes the platform or product more attractive to people who are not using it. The reason network effects are so valuable is because they fuel not just growth, but self-reinforcing growth. And once a certain level of scale is reached, it becomes really hard for competitors to enter and break that reinforcing loop. Network effects are hard to establish, but if a company can nail them, they become really hard to beat. Now, a company that has leveraged network effects really well is Meta. If you use Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, then very likely the reason you're on these platforms is because everyone else you know is. That's precisely what makes these platforms so valuable. And when you joined any of these platforms, if you did, you made the platform more valuable to existing users because they can now interact with you and connect with you. If Meta only had 1 million users on its various platforms, it wouldn't be very valuable. But because it has billions of users all over the world, it is by far the most valuable social networking company. And to be clear, in the beginning, Facebook wasn't that valuable. Facebook started out small. But because it invested heavily in attracting and retaining users, it was able to build a really strong competitive moat around its platforms that will be really hard for any non-incumbent to come and compete with. We call what Facebook has done direct network effects. Another type of network effect is the two-sided network effect. And the company Visa is a really good example of a company that has leveraged this network effect really well. Visa operates a global payment network that connects issuing banks, acquiring banks, merchants, and consumers. Visa does not lend. It simply coordinates transactions between all these different stakeholders, and primarily it's a two-sided network. On one side of the network, we have consumers who hold Visa cards. On the other side, we have vendors who accept Visa. And this is where the reinforcing loop comes into play. Consumers won't use Visa cards if few merchants accept them. And similarly, merchants won't want to accept Visa if few consumers have Visa cards. And so to build a business like Visa requires convincing both sides to join the network simultaneously, which is not easy. That requires building a high level of trust on both sides. But once a certain level of scale is reached, then the network expands rapidly and naturally, and again in a way that makes it really hard for new players to come in and compete. There are other types of network effects, but we'll leave it here. And the main point to consider is this. What makes network effects so strong and effective is that the number of connections a business can create increases exponentially as the number of users increases. So for example, if a business has 10 users on its platform, there are 45 possible connections between them. If the company has 100 users on its platform, then there are 4,950 possible connections between them. But if the number of users is 1,000, then the number of connections increases to 499,500 possible connections. That nonlinear growth is what makes network effects so hard to compete with once they've achieved a certain level of scale. Alright, so let's move on to the next advantage, which is switching costs. A switching cost is any cost, economic, operational, or psychological, that a customer has to incur when they move from one provider to another. High switching costs are not just about preference. They're about actual friction. If switching to an alternative is easy, customers will do it, especially if the alternative suits their needs. But if switching is painful, customers are going to hesitate, even if there are cheaper alternatives. Now, a company that is able to maximize that hesitation from customers has the opportunity to become a lot more powerful and a lot more dominant. Developing some level of switching costs is important because in a competitive market with no switching costs, customers are going to chase prices, which will compress margins and in turn make it harder for the company to generate excess returns. But if a company can develop high switching costs, then it will be able to do two things at the same time. It will be able to increase prices in the long run and retain customers. That additional pricing power will make it a lot more difficult for competitors to acquire new users. Now, the switching costs don't need to be enormous, but they need to be high enough that the pain of switching exceeds the savings from switching. If a company can create a bigger gap between those two things, it will be able to protect its margins a lot more easily. Now, a company that has done this really well is Apple. And what Apple did really well is that they didn't just create a product moat alone. They developed a completely closed-loop ecosystem that includes hardware, operating systems, services, and an identity layer, the Apple ID. Apple products are designed to work well within the Apple ecosystem with other Apple products and services. That is why people who use iPhones also have AirPods, Macs, Apple Watches, and store their data on iCloud. If someone only has an iPhone, then it wouldn't be hard for them to switch their phone. But because Apple has designed its products so that they work seamlessly together, once a user has become accustomed to the whole suite of Apple offerings, switching phones becomes much harder because it means replacing multiple devices and losing interoperability within them. It also means relearning workflows that were performed on each device and now having to deal with an ecosystem that's more fragmented between the different devices. That nuisance is a very high cost of switching over. Through the Apple ID, Apple also retains all of a user's data in one single ecosystem that accumulates lots of information over time. That includes things like photos, messages, contacts, passwords, and apps. That's important because switching devices now means migrating all of that data and losing seamless integration between the devices. That's a hassle that few people would be willing to deal with. So once Apple has gotten someone hooked on their ecosystem, it's quite easy for them to retain that customer and then maximize their lifetime value. That's what's allowed them to maintain such high gross margins and generate excess returns for such a long period of time. Alright, so that does it for switching costs. Let's move on to the third advantage that lends itself well to moats, and that's brands. Brand is one of the most misunderstood words in business and in investing, because people often think of brands as logos and slogans, awareness and marketing campaigns, or simply the popularity of a product. Those things are not brands. Economically, a brand is a persistent perception in the customer's mind that reduces their uncertainty and increases their willingness to pay for a product or service. It's something either psychological or experiential that they associate with a company that causes them to behave in a way that's more favorable towards it. Brands can develop into moats when competitors can't easily displace the perception that the company has created of itself, and when customers default to the business without evaluating other alternatives. Both of these things allow the company to increase prices without meaningfully reducing volume, which in turn reinforces the brand because it continues to get used and become more popularized in the culture. Brands do not emerge from marketing alone. They're created through consistent product quality, cultural embedding, and reinforcement through experience with the product. Marketing can certainly accelerate a brand, but ultimately it comes down to the product experience. If customers have a great experience with the product or service, then the brand will likely be able to sustain itself. But if that product quality and consistency is missing, then the brand will very likely fall apart. Brands are hard to replicate because they entail developing similar cultural associations, emotional experiences, and levels of trust. Those things are hard to develop because they're strongly tied to reputation. In fact, that's another way you can think about brand. Brand is simply the accumulation of a certain type of reputation. That's not something that's easy to create overnight. That's something that develops slowly over time. So how do brands show up in the numbers? Oftentimes, we'll see companies with strong brands have higher gross margins, lower customer acquisition costs, stable or rising price points, and consistent revenue through downturns. Now, a company that's developed a fortress brand within their industry is Nike. Nike is much more than just a shoe company. It's an athletics icon and an iconic brand. And that's because Nike didn't just build a product. They developed a whole concept and mythology around what they did. Nike was one of the first companies to stop selling features, like rubber soles or air pockets, and to instead start selling emotions. Oftentimes, brands talk about their products, but Nike instead associated its product with the best athletes in the world, and then focused on talking about the athlete. Their ads often don't show the shoe for the first 30 seconds. By doing this, they tapped into a universal human desire, the struggle to overcome. They positioned the customer as the hero, and the Just Do It slogan became the mentor. What they created was an experience that felt very personal and aspirational. Nike didn't just sign average athletes. They signed deals with the greatest athletes of all time, including Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, and Cristiano Ronaldo. Because these athletes were such iconic figures, they were able to create sub-brands that became their own cultural categories. The Nike Air Jordan shoe line is the best example of this. Nike also associated itself with every major sporting moment for the last 50 years, which in turn allowed the company to be viewed as a safe and elite choice among consumers. And so when people buy Nike shoes or gear, they're buying much more than just sports apparel. They're buying the apparel that will enable them to reach their own performance heights. Now, as we mentioned, brand has to be backed up by product quality, and that's certainly the case with Nike. Nike produces great shoes, shoes that provide actual performance. And so the emotions people attach to Nike are not just an idea, they're backed up by the products themselves. That in turn creates additional trust in the brand and allows Nike to charge premium prices while still retaining customers. That's what makes their brand so powerful. Alright, so that does it for brand. Let's move on to the fourth advantage that lends itself well to moats, which is scale and cost advantages. A cost advantage exists when a company can deliver the same product or service at a structurally lower unit cost than competitors, and also when that cost gap is difficult to eliminate. Now, there are two important phrases here. The first is structurally lower, and the second is difficult to eliminate. And here's what we mean by these two things. Temporary cost advantages don't count as moats. If a competitor can match your costs in 2 years by investing more, then it's not a moat. A true cost moat exists when your cost structure improves with scale, competitors cannot economically justify matching you, and when the gap widens as you grow. Alright, so let's break down the mechanisms behind cost advantages and also explain how scale actually lowers costs. The first way scale lowers costs is through fixed cost absorption. Many businesses have high fixed costs, like the cost to build infrastructure, or distribution centers or technology platforms, the money required for R&D projects, or the money required to develop logistics networks. Those costs, however, are fixed. They're one-time costs. And so as volume increases, these fixed costs are spread over more units, and so the cost to produce a single unit declines as a company produces more. Small competitors who don't get to that same level of scale can drive down the unit costs as well, which means that they won't be able to drive the price per unit as low as a scaled business. The second mechanism is purchasing power. Large firms can negotiate better supplier pricing, better payment terms, exclusive agreements, and volume discounts. These small cost improvements compound with scale. And so over millions of units, a 1 to 2% difference in unit costs matters enormously. The third is capital efficiency. Large operators often optimize the way they use assets, turn inventory faster, manage logistics more efficiently, and have access to cheaper financing. Now, these lower costs of capital create reinforcements on lower operating costs. The last one is data and optimization advantages. When a company operates at scale, it produces more data. More data improves forecasting, inventory management, route optimization, labor scheduling, and waste reduction. Small competitors don't get the same learning curve effects because they have less data to work with. Walmart is a great example of a company that has leveraged scale and cost advantages really well. Walmart is a hallmark brand, but Walmart didn't win in the retail game because of its brand. Walmart won in retail because of its relentless cost discipline and scale economics. And the first thing Walmart did to position itself as a really strong retailer was to develop a solid distribution infrastructure. To do that, Walmart built massive distribution centers, advanced logistics systems, and regional density before expanding nationally. All of this allowed Walmart to create a distribution network that significantly lowered unit costs. Competitors who were operating fragmented regional stores simply couldn't match those same standards. The second thing Walmart did was develop very strong purchasing power. Because Walmart bought its inventory at such enormous scale, suppliers became dependent on Walmart, and Walmart could then negotiate lower prices. Those lower purchase costs were benefits that Walmart could pass directly to customers through lower retail pricing. Now, those lower prices created more demand and drove higher volume with suppliers, and that higher volume in turn gave Walmart even more purchasing leverage. This became a self-perpetuating and reinforcing loop. Now third, because it developed these scale and cost advantages, Walmart didn't need to rely on promotions like other players. Instead, Walmart structured itself around consistent low pricing, operational efficiency, and minimizing costs. Competitors with higher cost structures couldn't sustainably match prices without compressing margins. Many of them tried, but ultimately they would fail to compete. And finally, as Walmart expanded, it was able to leverage its fixed investments more effectively. Advertising costs per store fell, all of its technology investments became spread across more volume, and its distribution routes became denser and more efficient because better store clustering reduced friction in logistics. As the company grew, each additional store became cheaper to operate than the last. So to replicate Walmart's position as a low-cost retailer, a competitor would need massive distribution investments, nationwide supplier relationships, lots and lots of volume at high density, and the ability to operate on razor-thin margins for years. Those are not things that a company can try to tactically achieve very easily. Those are structural advantages that take decades to develop. Alright, so let's quickly recap the things we've learned so far on the qualitative aspects of the competitive moat. Here's our definition for the competitive moat. A moat is a persistent structural advantage that allows a business to earn returns above its cost of capital for long periods of time, even in the face of competitive pressure. Moats are structural, and because of that, they're difficult to replicate. They're also typically built on having multiple structural advantages that compound on top of each other. Now, some of these advantages include high switching costs. Apple is a great example of this. Strong network effects, as in the case of Meta or Visa. A strong brand, like Nike. As we just showed with Walmart, scale and cost advantages. Moats are not easy to develop, and they're often created through intense focus over many years. But if a company can develop a strong competitive moat, its long-term growth prospects are much more secure. And as long-term investors, that's exactly what we want to see. In the next lesson, we're going to move beyond the qualitative aspects and discuss how moats reveal themselves quantitatively in the hard numbers. We're looking forward to it, and we'll see you at the next one.